But tonight, Paul is speaking, not walking. His subject is Arts and Crafts Richmond, Architecture and Design in the early years of the 20th century. Paul will speak for about 45 minutes, yes? And then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions. Please give a very warm welcome to Paul Velluet.
At first sight, there is little to connect this attractive three-storey house in Pagoda Avenue, Richmond, one of three pairs of houses built in the southern part of the Selwyn estate in 1891, with the arts and crafts movement that flourished in that fascinating period between the last years of the 19th century and the beginning of the Great War. But look more closely at these properties, particularly at numbers 5 and 7 at the northern end of the group, and you'll see not only the picturesque outline of the properties and extensive use of warm red brickwork, clay tile hanging, and white painted woodwork reflecting the character of the houses in Bedford Park not far away, but the use of that distinctive symbol of the aesthetic movement in the terracotta decoration on the walls, the sunflower, together with some fine cast terracotta numerals shaped in the best tradition of the arts and crafts movement. Similarly, at first sight, there is little to connect this beautiful late 16th century three-storey stone-built house close to the Thames in West Oxfordshire with the arts and crafts movement, or at least that in Richmond. But this is Kelmscott Manor, the summer retreat between 1871 and 1896 of William Morris and his family and friends, justifiably regarded as the father of the arts and crafts movement. And this is the frontispiece of his novel of 1890-93, News from Nowhere, his utopian vision of a truly socialist society based on common ownership, democratic control of the means production, an emancipated agrarian society following a quest for happiness in which all work should be creative and pleasurable. And here is Bedford Park in 1882, that renowned and most civilized garden suburb just up the road in Chiswick, created by Jonathan Carr with the development between 1875 and 1883 of some 490 homes across 113 acres of what was semi-rural Middlesex, with houses designed in the so-called Queen Anne style by architects such as Morris Adams, E.W. Godwin, and Richard Norman Shaw. Rightly praised by William Morris, Bedford Park clearly shows how his socialist ideals of an equal and creative society were moderated, or as some might suggest, compromised by pragmatism and the aesthetic tastes of the prosperous and discerning middle classes who flocked to live there. At the outset, I would suggest that the arts and crafts movement was one of the most significant movements in British design and architecture in the last 150 years, with direct parallels across the rest of Europe and in the United States, confined not only to that most interesting and transformative period spanning between the last years of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century, but a movement which has continuing influence in our lives through the interwar years, the post-war years, and right up to the present. Pick up and open any color supplement or interior design or lifestyle magazine, and you'll see that influence. As a movement, it drew upon the regional vernacular and long-established crafts traditions in building, carpentry, joinery, furniture, metalwork, and all kinds of textiles, glazing, lighting, ceramics, jewelry, typography, graphics, and much else, as well as celebrating the continuing relevance and value of the work of individual designers and craftspeople, rather than the products of large-scale industrial processes. The arts and crafts movement also celebrated simplicity and utility in design. In many respects, the movement was born out of a cultural and political reaction against the urbanization of society and increasing mass production during that last quarter of the 19th century, and the growing threat to the role of individual craftsmen. In England, led by figures such as John Ruskin and Morris, from the 1860s onwards, the movement found formal expression in 1884 through the founding of the Art Workers Guild, which continues still, and the establishment of the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society in 1888. From then onwards, increasing interest was shown by individual patrons, both large and small, and by middle-class consumers in products reflecting the long-established, generally rurally based crafts tradition and the design of products based on simple vernacular sources, ranging from entire buildings to smaller items such as jewellery. In time, such interest led to the establishment of firms such as Morris & Co., Liberties, and later Heels, all of which catered for the growing number of discerning middle-class customers at prices they could afford, and not merely the rich, many, of course, around in this town. It's interesting to explore how the arts and crafts movement and the closely related free style in architectural design are reflected in and around Richmond, ranging from entire buildings to church furnishings and from one-off commissions to catalogue items. Whilst we have no work in Richmond by leading arts and crafts architects of the period, such as Ashby, Bailey Scott, Horsley, Letherby, Pryor, Sedding, Dunbar Smith, Harrison Townsend, Voysey or Webb, we have plenty of other good work to value and enjoy. Just to try and discern, to figure out what one means by arts and crafts applied to architecture, first of all. Norman Shaw's Church of St Michael's in Bedford Park. Well, you can see it's got flavours of Gothic, bits of Renaissance, definitely the rural qualities too, lots of white paint, interest in materials. Is this truly arts and crafts? Or just going along the road, lots and lots of houses along the adjoining roads, full of these beautiful white painted timber railings, few of which you'll find in Richmond, sadly. Again, the red brick, subdivided windows, handmade materials, embossed terracotta. Interesting features. Are these truly arts and crafts? They were produced partly by manufacturers, partly from catalogue items, but put together in a loving and caring way, evoking perhaps a rural past. And then in that same area, you can see it from the train as you go towards Turnham Green Station on the district line on the left-hand side, this extraordinary house by Voysey, one of the most distinctive arts and crafts houses anywhere in London, if not the country. But its material is totally alien to Chiswick and Bedford Park and Richmond. It's made of, or faced in white harling, which has more Scottish connections. Is this necessarily arts and crafts? I would suggest it is very much arts and crafts because it evokes in part the past, subdivided windows, slightly medieval feel to it, the natural slated roof, but stark simplicity in its profile, and evoking in some respects the modern movement of 20 years later. And coming back more locally to East Sheen, this lovely house, slightly Queen Anne flavour, I suppose, but with the great Diocletian window at the second floor level. This is the junction, I think, Palewell Road and the road up to Richmond Park. Is this truly arts and crafts? Natural, traditional materials, lovely red tiles, lots of white painted woodwork, subdivided, echoes of the Georgian tradition at low level, but you wouldn't describe that as necessarily Georgian revival. Where does it fit? And very different, but not very far away, in that road that runs by the side of the park, Fife Road, number 33. Now that looks as though it's been there since medieval times, Tudor times, but no, it was only built in between 1923 and 24, and designed by the very great local architect Sidney Castle, who we'll hear about a bit more later. But evocative of the Tudor period of English architecture, plenty of timber, handmade materials, handmade clay tiles. This, I would suggest, is truly in the arts and crafts tradition, set in the middle of suburbia. And then slightly less quaint, if that's the right use of the word, just down the road in, is it Sheen or is it Mortlake, just the lower side of the Upper Richmond Road, in Holmesdale Avenue. Very much following the Dutch suburban tradition. If you walk across the river in Amsterdam, you'll see these 1920s estates full of houses which are very, very similar to these. So somebody who designed this, I've never found out who did design it, had been to Amsterdam before they sat down at the drawing board and devised this beautiful sequence of houses there in Holmesdale Avenue. And back to Sydney Castle again, on what's called the Barker estate between Richmond and East Sheen, on the northern side of the Upper Richmond Road, near where the old Derby Arms used to be, if you remember the Derby Arms. The building is there, the pub is gone. Castle's work for the development of the market gardens owned by the Barker brothers, no relation to Barkers in Kensington High Street. These, in my judgment, are truly arts and crafts houses, slightly later than our particular period in the early 20s. A vast estate stretching down towards the railway, down towards the Lower Mortlake Road, and transforming that part of rural, semi-rural market garden, Sheen, Richmond borders, into the suburb we love today. Following very much the traditions of commercial developers at the time, who saw the way forward to what was marketable and accessible at a price the ordinary middle classes could afford. And just wandering up the road off Sheen Lane, some more of these houses designed to be affordable, probably when this was built about 1930, at about £2,500, and just about within the reach of the ordinary middle to lower middle, upper middle class prospective owners, and offered on very, very good terms, generally. The mortgages advertised in the Sunday papers. And then for the posher classes, those with a bit of money, again in East Sheen, this great house at number 35, known as the Angles, this clearly wasn't in the reach of the ordinary mobile, upwardly mobile middle classes, but somebody with a bit of wealth. I think it's one of the most beautiful 20th century houses anywhere in this borough. It faces southwards across the road, Fife Road, towards the park, and it follows the butterfly tradition, which was again one of the traditional planned forms of large-scale houses in this period, 1900 to about 1914, on a sort of diagonal, of the corners at diagonals, so there's 4 diagonals and a central bay. A beautiful way of filling a house full of daylight, so there's windows on all sides. There's no proper front, no proper back. You go in here, but of course you go all the way around, and it's like a series of frontages rather than a back and a front and sides to it. And in a more urban setting on the Mortlake Road, this house, which at first glance might seem to have Georgian flavour to it, with the sash windows, subdivided windows, but just look at those other details around it, the moulding, the brickwork around those windows, the rustication at the corners, and details of the ironwork in front. This is not just Georgian revival, it's something which is rooted far more deeply in an arts and crafts tradition. And even with the more mainstream suburban development here in Kew and Ruskin Avenue, leading up to the Public Record Office, the National Archives, at first sight, ordinary, very attractive suburban housing. But if you look closely at the entrances, you see these beautiful glazed, lead-glazed tiles, as you do at the same period of underground stations in central London and elsewhere. So an interest not only in providing ordinary housing, affordable housing for the middle classes, but also enriching that with something evocative of the crafts tradition in these beautiful lead-glazed tiles. And what are the interiors of such homes? One might speculate the extent to which residents of Richmond, Kew and Sheen went out to buy the right kind of furniture, to be seen to be in fashion and to be popular with the neighbours, and to, I suppose, reflect their aspirations to the rural life. Here's a catalogue item from Morris and Company. This is William Morris at his most commercial, committed socialists, but not shy about dealing with the upper classes and the middle classes and producing products which were affordable to them. Handmade, but geared up very much for a commercial market. And you can see the variety of very attractive arts and crafts chairs there. The extent to which they were made in the West Country, in Gloucestershire, where so much good furniture came from, I don't know, but here they are. Or if you cross the road from Oxford Street to Regent Street, the advertisement for Liberty and Company. Liberty is starting as a small retailer and really flourishing in that golden era of the early 20th century, with products which again were accessible and affordable to the aspiring middle classes who wanted to be seen to have good taste rooted in the then fashionable arts and crafts tradition. And moving on from there, slightly later, well, they started in the early 1900s and are still around, thankfully, Heels in Tottenham Court Road, which produced furniture following this same arts and crafts tradition, set in part in the past, but bringing it to the present and making it at affordable prices for the middle classes. And certainly one could get one-off items such as this if you were reasonably wealthy. From Liberty's, their new studio range sideboard, you could get one of those from 1898 onwards. Lovely details, leaded lights and beautifully made bronze and brass hinges and drawer pulls. Or, if you were really going it, a Voysey-style chair of 1902. How many homes in Richmond and Kew and Sheen had chairs like those? I suspect many did. Or those with a more rural bent, going for a one-off ladder-back chair by Ernest Gimpson, who we'll see a bit later, but one of the greats of the arts and crafts movement based in the West Country. Or if you were an American visitor, this is produced by the American equivalents of such firms, by the Limbert's Company of Grand Rapids, Michigan. Beautiful oval table there, which could as well be produced by Gimpson or Voysey or Liberty's. And in the field of fabrics as well, beautiful patterns which I'm sure you will recognize. William Morris's Willow Bough. It was produced by Morris & Co. from 1887 onwards, and I think is still available. And I think just before it, by J.H. Dole, the daffodil design on printed cotton, also available from Morris & Company, and I suspect is probably still available today. And looking at the application of these aspirations towards partly the rural, and partly what was fashionable in terms of arts and crafts, go down to Station Parade Kew and look more closely, particularly at the gaps between the shop fronts. And in so many places in Richmond, in groups and terraces of shop fronts, they've just been painted over and covered over with burglar alarms and cabling and all sorts of things. But here, thankfully, in Station Parade Kew, you've got the survival of these beautiful, beautiful lead-glazed tiles, again reflecting the aspirations of those, a commercial client here, to give something back to the people of Kew and to make it attractive to the people of Kew by reflecting in the modest details between the shops some decent tiling. And here in Sheen Road, remarkably, the shop fronts have been messed up something awful over the last 20, 30 years, despite being a conservation area. But look more closely, and you'll see some beautiful glazed earthenware, again, of these pilasters and consoles between the shop fronts. At a more radical level, walk along George Street and look up. The premises, the shoe shop is presently vacant, so anyone interested in a vacant possession, there is waiting to be picked up. 7374 Great George Street, built about 1900, reflecting very much the flavour of the day, very different from other buildings going up, commercial buildings along George Street. You can see that same liking for the Scottish Harling at the second floor level, the painted render, the rough render. See the swags at the top with slightly Art Nouveau flavour, so a bit of French coming in. And you'll see the other details below, which partly echo Regency, Georgian. It's a fusion. It's part of that freestyle movement. It was a deliberate attempt to break away from conformist styles and develop something of a new age. And a close-up of it. It's a very, very fine building, and one looks forward to it being filled. And just around the corner, a remarkable refacing by Fuller's, who, as you know, did and still do run a lot of the pubs in Richmond and Kew and around. And this was a refacing of a partly early 19th century building, which the original Prince's Head. And it was led by the architect who worked a lot for Fuller's, particularly over in Brentford, where there's a whole series of very fine pubs, as well as civic buildings by Noel Parr, a name to be reckoned with. And he transformed this rather mundane, boring pub with the plain brick frontage into something again which traps the spirit of arts and crafts. The lettering, the harling, the painted harling, again with the feeling of Voysey at Bedford Park there. How conscious he was of Bedford Park at that time to do that. He did it elsewhere. But a beautifully crafted building. Tile work down below at ground level has been sadly overlaid with new tiling, but it's still, for the most part, a very fine public house. Close up of it. So when you've got like Georgian flavoured sash windows, yes, but it's much more than just Georgian revival. It's something distinctive of that early 20th century period. There's a close-up of this rough cast harling. And another pub, which a brand new building rather than the reworking of an older building, as at the Prince's Head. This is the White Horse in Walpole Way. It dates from about 1903, I think it is, if not a little bit later. And here, Noel Parr provided something which is truly arts and crafts. The steep gables, the tiling, the harling, and the general flavour, which captures in part an earlier English tradition, a rural tradition, but places it here in suburban Richmond at the lower end of the hill by Albany Passage. And here is another challenging one. Where do you put this? In what sort of stylistic box do you put the orange tree? Is it Baroque? And some of the curves there are distinctly Baroque in flavour. The stripy effect is certainly something Byzantine, and think of Westminster Cathedral. You've got the lookout at the top with a very fine dome on top. And then you have in the cusps, the half-moon-shaped cusps at the parapet, some extraordinary fine ironwork which characterises a sort of Art Nouveau flavour. So it's a real mix and match, but it all holds together beautifully in, call it, the freestyle or arts and crafts. It's borrowing from diverse sources and fusing them to something very special indeed. Great building, not listed, surprisingly, should be. And the little belvedere, and you can just see the ironwork at the top, and you can see the Orange Tree logo, which the Orange Tree Theatre adopted at an early age in the ironwork of the balustrading there. What was a very fine pub and sherry bar, some of you will remember Short Brothers, Shorts in George Street, now the Greyhound. You've got this entranceway from George Street, which is the old entry to the stabling at the back. It was a hotel. It hasn't been a restaurant or bar for about 40, 50 years or so. And there's the entrance to the ballroom, which was added in the early years of the 20th century. A beautiful marble staircase climbs up inside to the ballroom at high level, which backs onto the churchyard. And we've got glazed faience work as well as natural stonework here. It's a great, great pity we lost Shorts. It was a great institution, and one day I hope we can get back to something like that. A very, very different former pub, the Imperial, which enjoyed a certain notoriety in the 60s and early 70s. At number 3, the Square. 1890 is the date proclaimed at the top. But in what stylistic box do you push this building? Is it Georgian? Is it Victorian? Is it arts and crafts, truly? Is it freestyle? It's difficult to put it in a box. It's a glorious building, not perhaps listable, but a fine ornament all the same. Slightly more academic, the Town Hall of 1893 by W.J. Ansell, who worked for the council on several projects, including the Vestry House, we'll see in a moment. Here again, it's a difficult building stylistically to box, drawing on Renaissance roots, natural materials, sash windows of the Georgian tradition in part, moulded brickwork, a mix and match. And look at all those curves, delicious curves. That's one of the things which characterizes so much of this Edwardian early 20th century architecture, is the use of curving forms. And up the road, Ansell did the same, if at a rather more calm presentation, the Vestry House, the former Magistrates' Court, he did in 1895. Along the Kew Road, some of you will remember this as Richmond Adult College, run by the old Surrey County Council and then by Richmond Council. which was converted to sheltered housing about 30-odd years ago. This is the old County Boys' School of 1896, also a technical college. Extraordinarily flamboyant building, lots of curves to it, lots of mix of materials, lots of interesting tactile materials to it, and certainly not a building you could put neatly into a box other than saying it's freestyle. A close-up of that gable, and its successor as the adult college, which was, most of us remember, as the Richmond County School for Girls, a development by joint initiative between the Surrey County Council and Richmond Council, the original Richmond Council, dating from 1909. And the architects here, a little-known firm, Jarvis and Richards, and I think they deserve to be better known. They did a super job on that, which moves towards this, again, trying to find a box for it to fit in, Renaissance with a W, as following the Wren tradition. So it's less free than its companions up the road in Kew Road, but it's still one which is not truly Georgian. It's not Queen Anne. It's something rather more formal, but it's still got that freedom, the liveliness of roofline and little turret at the top. And just a glimpse again via the school there. Board schools were, I suppose, one of the main beneficiaries of the arts and crafts movement, certainly in London with the London School Board of London, and here outside central London with work by the Richmond Council and other bodies, church bodies. This is Prince's Road Junior School, Holy Trinity Church of England School, in the Alberts, and it follows much of the work by E.R. Robson, again a great architect of the early years for the LCC and the school board, but with influence here out in Richmond. But it's not as severe as the London board schools in places like Fulham and Hammersmith. It's that more flamboyant and that more sort of lighter weight, Miss Joyce. And I started off looking at some of the Bedford Park type properties up in Kew Road, Kew Road. Here in King's Road, King's House School, mix and match, tile hanging, nice brickwork, diaper effects, LED lights, all these nice materials, all coming together in a series of villas up and down King's Road, and now several of them, like 63 here, converted to a school. Behind, not very far from here, we've got the headquarters and drill hall of the East Surrey Regiment. Fine building. I suspect it may have been designed by the same firm, Jarvis and Richards, that did the girls' school close by. Built in 1912, not long after the girls' school, and extended in 1932. Jolly fine building with a very handsome coat of arms of the East Surrey Regiment, which had it as the TAHQ from 1912 through to quite recent years, now of course used by the post office. In relation to civic buildings, part of the, I suppose, the better part of the redevelopment of Paradise Road in the early years of the century is the police station, designed under the leadership of John Dixon Butler, who served as the Met Police architect from 1860 to 1920, quite a long, have I got that right? Up to 1920, from the 1890s. And he was responsible for countless police stations across London, some of which sadly are gone, many of which have been flogged off or waiting for new uses. And here we have our own police station, which of course is now used as a restaurant at low level and converted to housing above. It's a difficult building to categorize. I would suggest it has strong leaning towards the arts and crafts, not least if you look at the railings. Beautiful art railings, which have almost an Art Nouveau quality to them. Dixon Butler ran a brilliant office, and they were churning out designs in the best way for police stations across the metropolis, all of which have stood the test of time pretty well. Thoroughly built, useful traditional materials, lovely ironwork. Not the base of this building, you'll recognize this as dome buildings, but this, I suppose, a confection of the early years, the dome stuck on top. There was a time when there was a dome practically on every building in George Street, and no commercial premises was adequate without it. But here, added to the much older early 19th century dome buildings, which have been used as the public baths, library, lecture hall, and everything else. And coming back to the traditional residential qualities, Cardigan Mansions by an interesting chap called Paul Hoffman, who, judging his name, trained in Vienna and came over here and specialised not only in Richmond but in Kensington in particular, designing mansion blocks. Some extraordinary fine buildings going up in Richmond and Kensington in those early years. Cardigan Mansions here on the south side of the road. And see lovely ironwork, and meeting then a growing need for flats, which continued on through the interwar years in a big way in Richmond and many other suburbs, meeting a new need. Just to go back again to his other work, overpainted, sadly, Onslow Mansions in just off of Mount Ararat Road. Look closely, and at the low level you can see some sort of very much Art Nouveau qualities to this building. I think in the next slide, yeah. All the original railings were removed in 1940-41, ending their lives not as armaments but at the bottom of the Thames estuary, but some modest railings put back in their place. And a complete contrast, and where we come back maybe to William Morris and his more socialist aspirations rather than catering for the middle classes, Victoria Place, a development by the Richmond Council Housing. Richmond pioneered local authority housing. It was one of the first local authorities in the country to do so under the benefits of the Part 3 of the Housing Act 1890, Housing for Working Classes Act, and it developed down at Manor Road and here in Victoria Place as part of the large-scale redevelopment of that part of Richmond in 1909 to 1912. Not just on a sunny day do these look great, but just look at those features. Some lovely ironwork holding back with canopies, projecting canopies, beautiful ironwork. Rough cast render, again, coming in, so you've got that maybe Scots influence, and some very handsome circular windows. Great mix and match, but that was the joy of a freestyle as part of the arts and crafts tradition. It wasn't regulated and uniform, it was a freedom. And just instead of having boring straight stays coming down, iron stays holding back the canopy, you've got this beautiful twisted effect. That's done deliberately, not by accident. For the middle classes, not far away, Queensberry House, slightly later, the 30s, but showing still these strong influences of the early 20th century, with lots of leaded lights, beautiful handmade brickwork from Sussex, Surrey, and tile hanging, all the usual trappings, and something which evokes maybe the Tudor past with leaded lights, appropriate for site occupying part of the site of the old palace, and the more utilitarian area around the back. The gateways by the same architect who was Alfred Middleton Cock, who flourished in the early years of the century up until the Second War. The gateways in Park Lane. Fascinating building. You try and analyse this, it's got all sorts of intriguing interests, not least this chevron formation of windows. Attractive inside, a mix of decent traditional materials with some beautiful ironwork as well. And then our, I suppose, greatest building of the period, tail end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, glorious Richmond Theatre, Grade 2 star, listed by Frank Matcham, 1899, and a follower of the old Richmond Theatre Royal on the far side of the green. But just look at the complexity and diversity of all those features. You couldn't box that into saying it's just Victorian or late Victorian. You couldn't put it, say it's Georgian in flavour. It's a world apart from the old theatre on the other side of the green. All the features of raised lettering, of modelled terracotta, beautiful shapes and curves, very much in the spirit, that free spirit of the arts and crafts at 1890s, 1900s. And you get that too in the George Street, York House, 49 George Street. I think it's vacant at the moment, but just look at that beautiful ironwork at the top, touches of Bentley at Westminster Cathedral on the 3rd floor level, beautifully modelled plasterwork saying York House in the middle. The shop front is a little bit different. I don't know what box you'd put that in, but it's one which deserves more attention. Not listed, so it has modest protection. And this beautiful bank, no longer a bank, I'm not quite sure what's going to be next, probably another bar, what was Barclays in Station Parade Queue. But one of the most distinctive arts and crafts houses, I suppose houses the upper classes in Richmond, must be this one at 55 Kings Road. Architect John Simpson, who was partnered with the architect who did Wembley Stadium slightly later than this. An extraordinary building with dormer windows, which I've never seen the like of anywhere else, like eyebrows. Beautifully done with this curving formation of handmade tiles sweeping over the top. He designed that great boarding school for girls just outside of Brighton, amongst other things. And of course, with his partner, was much involved with the development of Wembley and the two towers, which are, of course, just a memory now. The nearest, I suppose, one gets to Art Nouveau in Richmond, I would suggest, is the RSPCA drinking fountain, horse trough by Colcutt, up outside the Star and Garter home that was, now Star and Garter House, I think it's called. Up on the hill near the park, 1891. Glorious piece of work, not only in that beautiful twisting ironwork, restored courtesy of the Richmond Society of recent years, regilded, lots of lovely features here, which you'll see a close-up in a moment here. You see nothing quite like it around these parts. This crown of lovely ironwork, which had got into a rather poor state, but it's been beautifully restored. Another close-up here. Fine piece of work, and if there's a box, if one is going to put in categories, boxes, then I suppose this might go into that which has the nearest leaning to Art Nouveau. And even the stone pillar at the middle has something, if not of Art Nouveau, then a bit more of arts and crafts to it. Pure arts and crafts, I would suggest, is maybe to be found in this memorial. It's a memorial to the artist, craftsman, and scribe Sutcliffe, Alfred Sutcliffe, and his brother George. Part of the inscription is quite late, if you can just about see the inscription. It's beautiful lettering from the 1940s, and the earlier part from the 1920s. But the shape and configuration and this simplicity of form, it's a beautiful, beautiful model of the arts and crafts tradition. And down the road, at the entry point to East Sheen Cemetery, created in 1906 by the old Barnes Borough Council, it was known as Barnes Cemetery. It's rebranded since its extension in the 30s as East Sheen Cemetery. These marvellous gateposts, most sadly, the ironwork disappeared as part of the war effort, but with parts do survive. And here, an exquisite example of handmade ironwork marking the gatepost, the beginning of the gatepost. And another example of this kind of thing on that little bridge that spans over the Ha-Ha between Old Deer Park and the riverside. Remarkable survival of the 1890s. And here, even finer art ironwork at St John's Hall by Arthur Grove of 1911. Beautiful building, and with work possibly by Gill as well, Eric Gill. So you wouldn't see this as Georgian or Georgian revival, you wouldn't see it as Victorian. It's Edwardian in terms of the age, but very much an arts and crafts building with this interest in varied handmade materials, handmade brick and natural stone. And some very, very fine lead work up on the dormers on the side. And as to the carvings here, I suspect that Gill, Eric Gill that is, because there were two Gills involved, his brothers as well, Gill may have had a hand in this. Arthur Grove, local architect, worshipped at St John's and designed both works to the church and to the church hall adjacent. And then this controversial east end of St John's, although it points actually technically south, with the controversial Calvary figure at high level. Only the lettering here is by Eric Gill. The carving itself is by Richard Garb, and that was undertaken in 1905. Stripy effect, the all sorts effect, which one finds at places like Bentley's Westminster Cathedral, here with just a London stock brick and natural stone. But the interior is, of course, a treasure house. All conceived by Arthur Grove, who worked in the office of Sedding, one of the great architects of the arts and crafts movement, together with numbers of others. And inside, decoration by Nathaniel Westlake. Here's a photograph of 1906, soon after completion, showing all the painted wall decoration within the building. That was over-painted because of its deteriorating condition in the 60s, but may be restored sometime in the next few years. And as it is today, with a very fine triptych over the altar by Westlake, with lettering done by Eric Gill. See the gilt lettering along there. And to the side, by the other Gill, MacDonald Gill, which is Eric Gill's younger brother, with painting by Dorothy Griset, and redecoration of more recent years by Howland Bellion. 1905 in the little side chapel. And some glorious, glorious stained glass by the leading arts and crafts stained glass artist of the period, Christopher Wall, dating from 1912. And another close-up of that glass. This is glass which has few parallels anywhere else in Richmond. And the slab glass used in the nave, and the ceiling decoration here by Nathaniel Westlake too. The furnishings, I come back to the figure of Ernest Gimpson, who flourished between 1864 and 1919, roots in the West Country in the craft tradition, and this is costly handmade work. This wasn't for the aspiring middle classes to fill their front rooms with. This is specially commissioned work for this building. Beautiful work of that period, spanning from about 1905, when this East End was created, to about 1912 in the side chapel, with very attractive lettering as well put in, and some interesting features here, this light fitting. And this, I think, reflects more than perhaps any other building in Richmond, the arts and crafts tradition narrowed down to really handmade products of ironwork, of joinery, of gilding, of lettering, more so than you would find in most private houses. And the paintings on the pulpit by Bromley. And again, the qualities of Gill reflected here in his lettering above the entry to the sacristy. In case anyone lost their way, that was the way to the sacristy. One of the most perfect little arts and crafts features in the entire borough, I would suggest, is this little figure here. This is by Henry Wilson. Some of you will know his name. He was a great, great figure, designer and architect of those early years, the 20th century. This is a little low-relief figure of the Christ child, very tiny little figure, set in the west end of St John's Church, and dates from 1910. But to come full circle and back to Victoria Place, because I think it's in Victoria Place that one sees this fusion of social purpose and architectural and design purpose, which embodies the values of Morris at his best. I've tended to focus in these illustrations on the diversity of architecture in Richmond, but I should stress my view that the significance of the movement at its height, its influence, needs to be addressed in the context of the period of remarkable social change extending from the 1880s up to the outbreak of the Great War. Nationally, it was a period that witnessed significant reforms and other changes, such as the introduction of the Education Act in 2002, the growth of women's suffrage from 1904 onwards, the growth of the George's People's Budget, Old Age Pensions Act in 1909, labour exchanges and their founding in 1909, the Insurance Act in 1911, the Parliament Act of 1911, together with the signing of the Entente Cordiale in April 2004, and importantly, the displacement of horse-drawn vehicles and motor vehicles in our towns and cities, more so than in Richmond. Locally, it was a period that saw significant developments in local government and the reshaping of Richmond, the creation of the Surrey County Council from 1889, the creation of the Borough of Richmond in July 90, the opening of the Town Hall in 1893, the building, significantly, of some of the very first council housing in the country, and the very first in London, down at Manor Road, by a very enlightened Richmond Council under the Working Classes Act 1890, and the planning, if not the implementation, of the Great Chertsey Road through Richmond and Twickenham and other arterial roads, way back before the Great War, in 1910, 1912, when most people were still going around with horse-drawn carts and buses. The central government was planning for arterial roads such as the Chertsey Road. But it also saw, on the downside, the major and highly destructive property clearances and road widening in the heart of Richmond, undertaken from 1909 through to 1912, that destroyed not only the ancient Red Lion Inn, but most of the Red Lion Street and the entirety of Artichoke Alley and Ormond Passage and the area bounded by Ormond Road, Castle Yard and Church Row. And most importantly, the residential development remained in pockets of unbuilt land, once forming the grounds of Halford House, Selwyn Court, Pagoda House, Mount Ararat House, Beaumont House, Ellicott House, Spring Grove, Lancaster House, all these big houses, some of which survived, thankfully, but their grounds were swallowed up by suburban development. At a domestic level, it is reasonable to speculate the extent to which the many hundreds of suburban homes built in and around Richmond of the period 1880s up to the outbreak of the Great War were furnished with catalogue items of firms such as Morris and Company, Liberties or Heels, and whether this was attributable to merely then current middle-class taste and fashion, or whether it reflected a genuine desire on behalf of householders to create something of rus in urbe and to enjoy products influenced by the vernacular and the craft tradition. Whatever the answer is, we are fortunate to have some very fine arts and crafts local authority housing surviving at the heart of the town, as here in Victoria Place. And I think William Morris might be pleased with the outcome in that development. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I don't know how many of you have been on one of Paul's walks. If you haven't, you now know what you've missed. And I've been on many of Paul's walks for about 25 years. This has been one of the most interesting walks. I didn't have to even leave my seat. It was marvellous. But I also think that he's empowered us to actually strike out on our own, to go and look at Richmond Quay and the wider area, and to look up and ask ourselves some questions, to be curious about what there is there, look for some clues, and come to conclusions of our own. So, you know, the weather's nice. We can go walking this week and see everything. Anyway, some questions. Do we have some questions? Simon at the back has got a roving mic, and Judy will shout out any questions which have come out on the Zoom.
Everyone's stunned into silence.
Don't all speak at once. Adam.
Quite early on, you showed a white Gothic-y house with quite small windows, and I was trying to place it. You said it was somewhere Turnham Green, going towards that estate?
That was the Voisey house on the north side of Acton Green, as it meets up with Bedford Park. It's 5 minutes walk from Turnham Green station, and you see it as you go heading up to town on the left-hand side. 3-4 stories, built a great studio at the top. It's a marvellous house inside and and it's sometimes open an open house weekend. But Voisey, it's one of Voisey's most famous works, and it borrows, like so many of the illustrations, from diverse sources, a lot from tall castles, fortified manor houses in the borderland, the use of harling, which is the rendered rough cast you see in so much of Scotland, with little leaded light windows, which borrowed from, I suppose, Tudor tradition, medieval tradition in England and in Scotland, with beautiful hand-cut split Westland, green Westland slates on the shallow roofs and some elegant ironwork. It is a stunning house. Sometimes the train stops before it goes into Turnham Green, and you can look at it closely. Or, if you've got time, just get off the train at Turnham Green, cross over the road and walk at it and just look at it. It is an absolute joy. And if you can get inside at open house weekend, it is fantastic. And the owners have really furnished it appropriately. his other Voysey work, which is usually close to underground stations. If you get off at Barons Court station, turn right and right again, there's another lower Voysey house, same materials, Westmoreland slate and Harling, but it's only a story and a half high, but it's got lovely ironwork. But it's not so beautifully looked after when I last saw it as the one at Turnham Green. But they are delights, and I'm only sorry that Voysey, as far as I know, didn't do any work here, except I have a theory that there's a wing behind the Richmond Hill Hotel, which is a lot of Voysey features to it, and I'm still trying to encourage one or two experts from the Voysey Society, which I'm a member of, to have a closer look to give a verdict, but I can't say it confidently. But it would be marvellous if there was to be a sudden discovery of a Voysey house in Richmond. If only.
Great. Next question. See you.
I have a sort of Voysey follow-up question. That's quite an unusual name. Can you tell, you're clearly a big fan, Paul. Can you just kind of contextualise this person? Is it a British?
Charles Francis Annesley Voysey, I think it's Scots background, trained in this country, worked in this country primarily. I think he did a little bit abroad. And my only connection, direct connections with, I used to know his son-in-law, who is sadly dead now, John Brandon Jones, and I was a student with his daughter. And John used to go around and entertain everyone with pulling out a snuff box and showing it around and saying, this snuff box belongs to Charles Francis Annesley Voysey, his father-in-law. Great architect. He flourished right up until about 1940s and started doing high-rise buildings. Some very strange products, which were sort of a bit like that, but stretched out about 10 stories, none of which, thankfully, were built. But he flourished like folk like Lutyens in the country house world, which was really to the fore in the pre-Great War era. And, of course, it was the Great War and the repercussions, socially and economically, of the Great War that did for big, large-scale country house building. And knocked a lot of these great architects like Bailey Scott out of the running a bit, and the clients, they had to shift towards a sort of more commercial base. But look him up, and he's a great guy.
Thank you.
Next. Question at the back, I think.
I've got a question.
Oh, go on, Simon.
Could you say a little bit more about the sort of socialist ideology and the way in which that is reflected in the actual architecture? So all the features that you were talking about, in what sense were they sort of giving sort of architectural life to his ideas?
Morris, and I have no doubts about it, was a committed socialist and was active, of course, with the Hammersmith Socialist League, as with other great figures like Gustav Holst a bit later on. And it was part of the Labour movement, which was flourished in those early pioneering years at the beginning of the 20th century, which were pushing for major reforms. For Morris, he linked it with his idealised world, which he wrote about in his utopian novel, News from Nowhere, about a, say, make-believe world. I think he actually believed there could be a world where work would be a pleasure rather than labour, where the creative artisan would lead the way, and where there'd be fairness and equality at all levels. Whether one describe him also proto-feminist, I don't know, because he certainly worked with many very, very creative and able women artists and craftspeople, but moderated his view about different roles for women in the household, women at home, and the role of men. But it was an idealized view, but it was, as far as architecture and design and the sort of buildings we're looking at, it was rooted very much in wanting to celebrate, promote, and make accessible the work of individual craftsmen rather than machine-made, factory-made products. But for all his socialism and his commitment to the socialist cause, he was also a pragmatist and a shrewd businessman, which is a powerful combination. And he recognized that in order to share these beautiful products he couldn't just do it with individual craftsmen working for the West Country and deepest Gloucestershire on individual items of furniture. He used to have to go into not mass production, but into a more organised production and selling to the middle classes in his showrooms in Oxford Street to produce the wherewithal, whether it's in fabrics, textiles, wallpapers, or furnishings and furniture. And it was picked up, that struggle, I think, for many so many people would love to have handmade furniture, handmade buildings, but that is, for the most part, for the rich. It was today, and was then. And it was having to moderate that idealism that pushed them towards making products which were accessible for the then blossoming middle classes, so they could afford it. So I think he's a man full of compromises, but a truly great man, and I think some people say he was a bit two-faced by claiming socialist credentials and selling to the toffs his expensive fabrics from his showroom in Oxford Street. But he was a pragmatist, and I think his values are around today still. And as it said at the start, you open up any colour sup or lifestyle magazine, and you'll see this glorification of life in Oxfordshire, in either modern or converted farm buildings with handmade furniture or what looks like handmade furniture. And I think it's also to make it accessible to middle classes. It's represented, and I think Morris would be quite happy to see along the North Circular Road that great Swedish furnishing establishment and its ability to produce good quality, simple, good design, if not made by craftsmen down in deepest Gloucestershire, but something which is, well, has a utility to it and a simplicity, and above all is accessible to ordinary people to use. So I think he's a truly great figure, and this is the great biography of him, which I think reflects all those diverse qualities. Other architects didn't have, I think, those principles, and a few had that in-depth commitment towards the socialist cause, let alone a very idealised one. And I think he recognised that was impractical. Who was going to be driving the trains and delivering the food and all the rest of it in his idealised society? I don't know.
Simon, there's a question at the back.
Yes.
Judy, yes.
First of all, I want to say there are lots of comments on Zoom saying how excellent the talk is and how lots of people are going to be looking around them much more carefully than they did before. But there's also a couple of specific questions. Actually, one person also said, my grandparents were married in St John's in 1901 and must have witnessed some of the beautiful items you've highlighted. Lots of stuff to look at in my next break in Richmond. Okay, so two questions. One, does Paul know who designed the frontage of Barclays Bank at Station Parade, as it is quite different to the rest and must have been created later? And a second question, did Morris have his own factories, and where were they?
The bank, I don't know the architect, but I make the assumption that it was either Barclays' in-house architect or an architect practice which they used regularly at that time when that frontage was put in, which I suspect went in pretty early on, if not when the parade was built in, was it 1891 or whatever. So I don't know the answer to that one, but it's a fine piece of terracotta work, and I hope it has a good future. And I'm only sorry, one, to see a bank close, too many banks closing, not least that one, but I hope it has a benign new use. On the other question, just remind me, on the...
His own factories. And
yes, he did, and workshops. And they were run, I think, on sound principles. He certainly was no slave driver, and he needed talent to work in them. It was down in London, it was down in the West Country as well. It was geared up for production, but not mass production in the worst sense of the word. They weren't like factories. They were workshops in which individual workmen, craftsmen and craftswomen worked. And again, they're covered in some detail in the great biography of Morris, which is worthy of reading. Name escapes me of the
Fiona
author.
McCarthy.
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah. And there's just published a very slim volume, a memorial to her, which is a sort of summary of an essay she wrote about Morris. In about 40 pages, she covers his life beautifully.
Let's say in relation to Barclays Bank and Station Parade, we have booked 12 months today, next October, Stephen Bartlett, who's spoken to us before about Lawn Crescent and other places in Kew. He's doing a talk about John Hamilton, architect of Kew. He lived in Kew for a while, who built the parades at the station. He'd probably be the person to ask the question about Barclays Bank.
I have a question. You've mentioned a rather fabulous building that wasn't listed or protected, and you've talked about a lot of different features. To what extent are they protected in the planning system, or to what extent are they vulnerable to developers?
Well, most of those buildings I've shown in Sheen and Kew and Richmond are within conservation areas where there's a reasonable degree of control. Whether that's exercised with the level of discretion, discernment that one hopes by Richmond upon Thames Council is debatable. There are formal permission is required for their demolition or their external alteration or their change of use. And many of them are listed locally, not to be confused with statutory listing, which imposes quite rigorous controls, but locally listed, which flags them up as being meriting attention and care. It's down to the local authority, Richmond upon Thames Council as the planning authority, to deal with those. I'm sometimes critical of Richmond Council and its approach to planning, and it depends upon local people if they're concerned about a particular building in its future. It's really through their local councillors to press and encourage the right results, whether it's to support the good things or to oppose those things which are damaging. But it's down to the local authority to control those things. I hope that answers the question.
Any more questions?
Good.
If not, could I invite Simon Target to tell us about the next talk, because you're the next speaker, aren't you? Maybe you could tell us a bit about it.
So the talk next time is about Robert Walpole. So Robert Walpole was the first Prime Minister, first person to be given number 10 Downing Street. And he had a lot of local connections, so the talk is about his local connections, in particular his link with Richmond Park, but also, of course, his son, Horace Walpole, who's well known, and various other links. So that's what it's about. And it's 300 years since he came to office in 1721, and he was the longest serving Prime Minister, 21 years.
Good, we finally got the slide we were looking for earlier. Thank you, thank you. Can I just give a word of thanks, by the way, to Conrad and Matt at the back, and to Judy for making sure the Zoom happened and everything. And I have to say, my first time in this room in its present format, I think they've done a marvellous job, haven't they? The sound is fantastic. My lighting's lovely. So I think a round of applause, please, to Duke Street for making it happen. But also I'd like to say thank you to all the volunteers from the Society, my wife Judy at the back, Shirley and Joanna on the bookstall, another Shirley at the door on a membership, Liz who took the bookings, Simon Target who's been helping us with the mic. Anything else I've missed? And a big thank you to Paul for a fantastic talk. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you. Now, Paul, are we going to the pub afterwards?
I'm going, as nobody else is going.
The Duke?
If it's open.
The Duke, opposite
Yes.
the...
Going opposite the frontage to the church.
Anybody else welcome to join us. Yes. And see you next month.